African Americans in the United States?
I will say it again. I do not. I think the harm comes when you have some very bad apples on the law enforcement side.
That's Trump's economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, and just the latest administration official to come out in recent days saying there is no systemic racism in America. Now, the hundreds of thousands of Americans hitting the streets for the past 2+ weeks since the killing of George Floyd, they obviously disagree with the sentiment, and they are demanding change, particularly when it comes to policing. And when you look at the numbers, now I'm going to show you, it sure looks like all those protesters have a pretty strong point. FBI stats show that blacks arrested 5 times more than whites. And when you look at Minneapolis, the city where Floyd died, African Americans account for almost 2/3 of the arrests, but they're less than 20% of the population. And policing in America was the subject of a hearing on Capitol Hill yesterday. George Floyd's brother, Philonis, he was one of the speakers.
Please listen to the call I'm making to you now, to the calls of our family and the calls ringing out the streets across the world. People of all backgrounds, genders, and races have come together to demand change.
Well, my next guest, he also testified on the Hill yesterday. Marc Morial, president and CEO of the National Urban League, and he's former mayor of New Orleans as well. Thank you for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me.
You know, I've been wrong, Marc, so many times before when I think of this an act in this country, Sandy Hook, and the shooting at the schools that I thought definitely would have led to real transformative change when it relates to guns in this country. Obviously, I was wrong. I'm looking at numbers, though, that I've never seen before in terms of public sentiment. More than 3/4 consider racism and discrimination a big problem. That's up 26 points from just 5 years ago. I'm looking at how people view Black Lives Matter. It had a negative view a few years back, now almost plus 30% a positive. Am I wrong to look at both this moment as an opportunity, but also public sentiment, a place we've never seen before, about a need to do something regarding race and policing?
Richard, the American people are often loaded with surprises. And I think they've surprised many in how they've reacted to the killing of George Floyd. And I think the reaction has to do with there was no room for doubt. There was no room for misinterpretation. There was no room for an excuse. George Floyd was killed on the streets of Minneapolis. He was lynched, in effect. He was asphyxiated when a police officer had his knee on his neck. 2 other officers held him down while he was handcuffed. A 3rd officer stood watch while citizens were there begging, saying, he's dying. There's blood coming from his mouth. Do you need me to take his pulse? And I think the American people have acted with a sense of humanity and an understanding that these problems are deep and they are significant. And the outpouring of protest and the outpouring of concern and the outpouring of action makes this an important time in American history.
Obviously, you're preaching to the converted here, Marc, so I make mistakes sometimes about talking to people I agree with. But listen, at the hearing yesterday, there was an undercurrent of, hey, listen, Floyd was no angel, okay? And you know what? You turn on the TV and you look at Chicago, you see black on black crime. And you got a lot of households in inner cities that don't have two parents in there. And maybe if you go back to the family unit more, we wouldn't have the same problems that we see right now. And those are the people, putting it politely, you wonder what's said behind closed doors. So my point is, to that audience, Marc, what is the answer to say, no, that's not, there's no rationale for what happened to him on the streets of Minneapolis in broad daylight? How do you cut through what's really, I don't know, a diversion, frankly?
Stop. I think people have to just stop changing the subject. Look, there are white families that don't have 2 parents. There are white families with children who have problems with drugs, mental and psychological problems. The problems of black families are not peculiar or particular to black families. That's one important thing. And number two, understand that all of those quote unquote rationales, reasons, and excuses haven't fixed anything, haven't solved anything, haven't made this a better nation. Right now, we have two justice systems, one for white Americans, one for black Americans. We have two methods of policing, one for white Americans, one for black Americans. There are many allies who are not African American who've been, I think, taken with this cause, understand the moment we're in, and I think really truly support the idea that this moment ought to be a new movement in America.
You know, Mark, what has, I think, surprised a lot of even well-meaning white people in this country is how many people, successful African Americans like yourself, have come out and said, I'm not immune to this. It happened to me. You know, and I think it's interesting. We're about to get into the political arena. Tim Scott, the only African American member of the GOP in the Senate, or maybe even for the House for that matter too. But anyway, he went on the floor of the Senate and talked about being racially profiled. And I think people forget that. How important is it, and maybe if you want to share a personal story yourself, yesterday we spoke to the mayor of St. Paul, whose father was a cop in the same city here, and what he endured even as the mayor of that city. Talk about how systemic it is. I'm sorry.
Let me tell you, it happens on so many levels, Richard. You know, I, within the last 3 to 4 years, have been taken for a chauffeur or a driver when standing in a hotel with a briefcase, with a cell phone, and with a suitcase, waiting for my driver to pick me up to go to an airport after a trip. I've had people walk up to me as though I were their driver, as though I was the doorman, because I'm an African, a black man, a man of color in a suit, dressed up in a hotel. And so, you know, those things are, you know, they're insulting. It's not to equate it with being beat or being killed or being brutalized. But all of us have experiences. But people should not have to endure that. And you shouldn't have to have such an armor of resilience to be able to make it or survive in this country, right? It shouldn't be that way because it's not that way for white guys.
Last thing, there is wide reporting here that there's real division in the White House because those close to the president don't know if he is both capable or even willing to try to deliver a speech about unity with, God knows, a fractured America right now. We get used to a lot of things, but I'm curious, do you think how bad the president has been on this has actually helped galvanize so many people? Or do you think that because we can't have a president exhibit even a scintilla of empathy for this, it's holding back the change that we need in this country?
I do believe that the undercurrent of just outrage at the president's approach to race and approach to black and brown and Asian communities, you know, the accusation that the quote virus was quote the Chinese virus. You start your campaign by saying you're going to build a wall. You talk about blocking travel to countries predominantly populated by Muslims. You criticize African American ball players. And then underneath it, you have policies where you don't enforce civil rights laws. You seek to gut the Community Reinvestment Act. I mean, look, it would be more impactful for the issue if instead of making a speech, he would order the Justice Department to rescind the Sessions memo, which stops the Justice Department from investigating pattern and practice violations. It would be more impactful if he said, I'm going to follow the civil rights community on their comprehensive police reform bill and not try to come up with a clumsy executive order or some sort of alternative bill. It would be more impactful to do that, to act. And this is a time when action is more important than words. And I told the members of the House yesterday that this is a moment where people will ask 50 years from now, where'd you stand? Where were you? Where did you stand at a moment of crisis for the nation? Did you stand in support of reforming the police and fixing the systems in this country, or did you resist? Or did you make excuses? Or did you fall prey to hollow arguments of yesteryear? That's the question.
Marc Morial, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. Thanks, Rich.
All right, everybody. When we come back, we are already seeing rapid changes in this country as we wait for Washington to get off the dime. Since the death of George Floyd, we've seen in the world of sports and pop culture some really transformative events here. After the break, we're going to show you how that tragedy has already been a huge catalyst for change.